Gonna make it through this darkness. A light would shine someday for me. Yes, it will. I know that you won't leave me in this thing. Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? I heard him say, hush, don't say a word. Gonna get messy if anybody heard. I heard him say, hush, don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know who I am? A well-known woman, a respected man. Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? I heard him say, hush, don't say a word. Gonna get messy if anybody heard. I heard him say, hush, don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you'll put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know who I am? A well-known woman, a respected man. I'm breaking the silence 'cause I'm under attack. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. And take my life back. And take my life back.
Tremendous welcome to this very special project that affects our children. And I just want to explain briefly the format of this session. We will have first the main speaker, which is Dr. Sandra Reid. She will do a 30-minute presentation to be followed by a 25 minutes of panel discussion, and then it will be open to members of the audience for questions and answers. This particular session is on child sexual abuse and its relationship with HIV. And as one of the components of the BTS project, it was to find out what are the services available, who are the service providers, etc. And in January of 2010, there was a presentation to service providers. And Dr. Reid will now, go into details as to the outcome of that study. But before that, I should introduce Dr. Reid. We are very fortunate to have this distinguished lady with us today because I know she's extremely busy. Dr. Reid is a senior lecturer in psychiatry in the Faculty of Medical Sciences of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and the director of the Caribbean Institute on Alcoholism and Other Drug Problems. She is also a regional teaching, which is a regional teaching institute. That is the Caribbean Institute on Alcoholism and Other Drug Problems. Dr. Reid is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, as many of us are, from Moonan, Jamaica, where she obtained her undergraduate degree in medicine, MBBS, and her specialization also in psychiatry was also obtained there. She went on to obtain the Master's in Public Health from the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and was the recipient of a NIDA-sponsored Hubert Humphrey Fellowship Award in Substance Abuse and Management and Research, which she pursued at the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. In addition to clinical and teaching positions, at present, Dr. Reid is an associate in the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, UWI St. Augustine, and an adjunct lecturer at the University of Toronto. Her research activities have included women, drugs and HIV, public health, consequences of substance abuse and HIV, and interventions for high-risk sexual behaviors in marginalized populations. She has published peer-reviewed articles and book chapters in these areas. Dr. Reid has received several international research grants, and she has been one of the lead researchers of the IGDS Gender, Sexuality, and HIV project since its inception in 2004, and is currently involved in the two major research projects, Breaking the Silence, Child Sexual Abuse and Incest, Implications for HIV/AIDS, and Building Responsive Policy, Gender, Sexual Culture, and HIV/AIDS in the Caribbean. So without further ado, I hand you over to Dr. Reid.
And a very pleasant good morning to all of you. I'd like to add to what Tisha said and to what Milen said, in that it really is a pleasure to see so many persons here this morning, and we really do hope that you benefit from what we have to share. For the next 30 minutes, what I would be looking at is just giving you some findings from the report on the study of service providers and draft policy workshops. Those were actually two independent interventions related to each other but independent that took place in the course of the study. So I'm going to try to spend just about 15 minutes on one, 15 minutes on the other, following which we will have the panel discussion. The service provider study and the draft policy workshops, as I said, are both components of the Breaking the Silence project, but these looked particularly at child sexual abuse, HIV, and the implications for social policy, legal practice, and human rights. This aspect of the project speaks directly to the third of the three short-term objectives that you would have read and heard about earlier this morning when Professor Reddock gave her presentation. You would see that the third of the short-term objectives speaks of revising or enhancing gender-sensitive policies and procedures related to child sexual abuse and incest, which conform to international human rights standards. The service providers study actually sought to obtain data on the various policies, procedures, and practices of service providers working broadly in areas related to child sexual abuse and HIV/AIDS in Trinidad and Tobago. It was a purposive sample that we looked at of 68 service providers in 28 different agencies, social health and legal, in Trinidad and Tobago. We interviewed 40 persons whom we described as direct frontline service providers. Those were the persons who were actually interacting with individuals as they came to seek help. But we also interviewed from the 28 agencies, 28, we call them indirect staff, the persons who were the supervisors, who did not have much, if any, interaction with the clients who were seeking help, but who were in decision-making positions. We targeted all the national agencies, so it was of sorts a national study, but we also included community-based agencies in the three target communities of the study. And as you might remember, those were Toco, Aranguez El Socorro, and Charlottesville in Tobago. The agencies that were visited, they were broad, and they included social welfare agencies, women's services, children's homes, the police, foster care services, social services, school-based social services, family court, health centers, hospitals, national family services, and the hotline. That's just to give you an idea of the wide range of services that we looked at. Any service that we felt might have had a reason to engage with a child who had the potential to be a victim of child sexual abuse. What I will present to you in the first 15 minutes would be a summary of the findings that we got from that particular study. Not all of the findings, but the findings that related particularly to policy aspects of care for victims of child sexual abuse. These findings, which I'm about to give to you, were presented in two prior service provider workshops, which brought together the service providers who were interviewed for the first study, as well as a larger cohort of professionals involved in delivery of service in Trinidad and Tobago. At that second session, which we call a draft policy session, the findings of the initial survey were presented and discussed, and participants were facilitated through a process of feedback and policy recommendations. So what I'm going to be presenting to you this morning, as I said, is a summary of the findings of the initial workshop, or the initial survey, and also a summary of the recommendations from that draft policy workshop. With me? Yeah? Okay, good. So we're looking first at the findings from the service provider study. We use semi-structured interviews to collect quantitative and qualitative data, looking at the existence and nature of policies, protocols, and procedures for child sexual abuse service provision. We also looked at knowledge, attitudes, and gender sensitivity of service providers towards child sexual abuse. You're not going to hear so much about that this morning. And of course, the awareness of the relationship between child sexual abuse, incest, and HIV/AIDS. The first striking finding was that agencies operate in a context where demand for services profoundly exceeds service capacity. Almost consistently through the interviews, what we found is that the legal and institutional infrastructure, or lack thereof, actually undermined the child protection efforts at multiple levels of service provision. Agencies were functioning in resource-limited environments where innovation and creativity were necessary for service provision. And in a little while, I'm going to give you an example of what we mean, or what they meant, because they used the words innovation and creativity. Now, this was in sharp contrast with the perception by the service providers that the prevalence of child sexual abuse was increasing. Respondents noted that they had observed a sharp increase in reported CSA cases within the prior 5 years, and they attributed that increase to the increased visibility of child sexual abuse cases in the print and television media. The extent to which cases had been increasing was highlighted when one respondent indicated that in an NGO in one community, the police station received at least 5 cases of incest reported on a daily basis. That was the contribution from one respondent. He said in that particular community, there were at least 5 reported cases daily at the police station. What was also noted by one other respondent is that carnival season seemed to be a peak period for the reporting of child sexual abuse. And respondents also went on to share that there are in fact some primary schools and communities throughout the country which have developed a reputation for the occurrence of incest. Thus, you find that the agencies were actually challenged to secure the safety of abused children, because on the one hand, the resources were markedly limited, and on the other hand, they were pretty much overwhelmed by the increasing presentation of these cases. So agencies faced the formidable challenge of meeting the demand and securing the safety of vulnerable children and young persons who had been sexually abused. Even within the existing resources, what was found is that many challenges still existed. One of these was the absence of a standard definition of a child. For the majority of agencies, the definition of a child was taken from the legal statutes, an individual under the age of 18 years, and that was based on the UN Convention of Rights of the Child. Some agencies, as you would see from this bar chart, however, considered under 16 or under 21 years to be a child. And a few residential agencies did not accept persons over the age of 12 years old because their definition of a child was anyone under 12 years of age. Those who were using under 16 years explained that they were guided by the Children's Act and the Sexual Offences Act. And those who were using the age of 12 were actually guided by a policy that had been instituted among women's shelters, which said that children above the age of 12 should not be kept in shelters. So immediately you see the confusion that existed, because in the various agencies, the definition of a child varied considerably. And we would appreciate that that is an integral part of policy and procedure that could have crucial implications for service provision to children who who are sexually abused. Children who are victims of child sexual abuse and who seek help are likely to encounter other multiple obstacles. Generally, what was reported is that there are no child-centered services. Very few agencies, in fact, provided child-centered services. And when we talk about child-centered services, we define that as services which are adapted to the needs and concerns of children as opposed to adults. Child-centered services, therefore, should allow children to access services once they are needed. What the study found, however, is that children generally cannot and do not access services unless accompanied by an adult. Service providers cited the law as the reason why they did not offer service to children alone. But even while describing that to us, they acknowledged that the accompanying adult in some cases may very well have been the perpetrator of the sexual abuse. So there was that conflict in persons wanting to follow what was considered the legal policy and recognizing that in fact it was a policy that was not in the best interest of the children. None of the agencies were really child-centered. They were more family-oriented. They provided services for child sexual abuse as part of a range of a multiple of other services: physical, psychological, psychosocial, and economic needs. What the service providers also shared with us is that boys are less likely to receive help for child sexual abuse. From their experience, they reported that boys were more likely to present not as victims of child sexual abuse, but as victims of neglect, abandonment, or because of delinquency and disordered behavior, meeting the criteria of conduct disorders. There were services, however, which a child of any age could access, and I know we have quite a few persons in the audience who are from the school services. And what the service providers told us is that counseling in schools could in fact be accessed by children who are not accompanied by a parent. However, as part of the intervention process, contacting parents or caregivers was a necessary part. So in any case, the parents had to become involved. I think there was a ray of hope on the horizon when the Mount Hope Hospital Medical Sciences Unit opened the Child Sexual Abuse Unit, and that was opened in July 2008. We interviewed our service providers, asking them about their referrals for HIV testing. You'll see that in a little while. And many of them reported that they in fact did refer for HIV testing, and that that development had occurred at the time of the opening of the CSA unit. So that unit did have some kind of impact. However, at our policy roundtable, we had with us Dr. Jasmine Ramcharan, who is in charge of that unit, and she shared with us that in fact at present she is the lone staff member in that unit. She is overwhelmed, she is torn apart, and I would not be surprised if any time now that unit is going to be shut down. One other service which is worthy of mention is the ChildLine service. That's the only 24-hour hotline which caters to children and provides counseling and crisis intervention. They also go to schools and provide outreach. But their services are limited because there is no intensive follow-up available. Other barriers that children victims of child sexual abuse are likely to encounter were related to the attitude of service providers. One respondent shared with us that children who are sexually abused are, and I quote her, made to feel like the abuse is their fault. They, referring to specific service providers, also question the child's ability to reason, asking things like, are you sure it was a penis? How are you so sure it was not a piece of wood? So our study did look at the attitudes of service providers. As I said, I'm not going to be sharing too much of that now, but I presented this particular quote to show that the barriers existed not only through a deficiency of resources, but also through the attitude on some occasions, and I presume that it's in the minority of cases, but on some occasions, the attitude of the service provider may in fact be the stumbling block to appropriate care. Some service providers do not address child sexual abuse unless mandated. What do I mean by that? We found that referral is a standard practice in agency procedures when child sexual abuse is reported. Service providers, however, reported to us that they avoided the issue of child sexual abuse when it was not in the agency's mandate. Again, I quote, "This is not in our jurisdiction or work portfolio." It was very sad to hear the report of one respondent who indicated that his agency, doing field work, came upon a community where almost everybody had been a victim of incest, and they did nothing. There was no referral, there was no intervention. Why? Because it was not the mandate of his agency. So that is something that I think is extremely significant, and it is one of the findings that we encountered. Fear of assault by perpetrators. And I put this in here not because the said gentleman said this, but this was a finding that kept coming up as well, that fear of assault by perpetrators is reported by service providers and is cited as one reason why they are reluctant to get involved with such cases. There were also procedural challenges that were encountered. Firstly, we were told that agencies do not readily accept all reported incidents by minors as truth. There was a stark contrast between when a child reported being a victim and when the parent reported that the child had been a victim. When the parent reported, there was no speculation or a decision to check to see if it is truth. On the other hand, when minors reported, there was always that element of doubt. Those of you who were here last night saw the presentation by Arts in Action, and you see the reluctance of the parent to accept the possibility of child sexual abuse in the child victim. Now, there are many reasons for that. We're not speculating, but the fact is service providers, even as service providers, were not immune to some of the other societal issues that we found in our study. One other procedural challenge that was brought to our attention was a lack of consistent training for female police officers, which sometimes resulted in inadequate procedure and a failure to meet the requirement of physical evidence. In order for a case to go to court, there must be physical evidence of child sexual abuse. And if the correct procedures are not followed and no physical examination is done, then that's it. There is no way forward to go. And what we were told in our interviews is that there seems to have been inadequate training for some of the officers, which in fact worked against the best interest of the child. Agencies generally lacked written procedures. The majority of agencies did not have written procedures for service provision, and that was especially so when we looked at what happened when unaccompanied minors went to seek service. 75% of service provider respondents indicated that there were actually no written procedures. Another problem that was encountered is the issue of confidentiality and anonymity. Most agencies that guaranteed confidentiality, of course, made exceptions for mandatory or compulsory reporting. However, only a very small number of participating agencies required that employees sign confidentiality agreements, and anonymity was generally not assured by the agencies. Lack of training. When we looked to see what had taken place in terms of training, we found that there was no specific or standardized training available on child sexual abuse in Trinidad and Tobago. And many frontline workers shared with us that they were learning as they went along. 50% of service providers who had been interviewed had been exposed to any kind of training in the area of child sexual abuse. Only 29% of participating agencies offered any kind of gender awareness training for staff. And while 75% of persons revealed that they had been exposed to HIV sensitization, only 50% regularly referred victims of child sexual abuse for HIV testing. Here we have two pie charts. There's a little spelling typo. You probably would not have seen it if I hadn't pointed it out. But recommendations of HIV testing for victims of incest, 50% of the time this was done. Testing is not always recommended for the victims. Now, interestingly, recommendations for HIV testing were often left to the discretion of the frontline worker. Again, no policies, no procedure. If the person felt that this was an important step to take in the management of the child, then it was done, left to the discretion. There were only a small number of agencies that included recommendations for HIV testing as its policy. And we would note also that only 36% of agencies actually provided services to child sexual abuse survivors who are HIV positive. The actual standards for care were also deemed non-existent. A number of agencies lacked the structures to monitor and evaluate adequate care of users. So while there was a willingness and a passion among the service providers, the overall lack of structure, lack of policies, lack of procedures for service provision adversely affected the capacity of agencies to provide optimal services. What happened then? Agencies that had no mandates for child protection, when they encountered child sexual abuse, basically left the cases unattended. And many children who were known to be victims were sent back to their homes. I call that a certain apathy among service providers, an apathy that we certainly cannot blame them for. In psychology, we would call it learned helplessness. I mentioned before the importance of having evidence when a child is sexually abused. One issue that came up in our data collection is that there are in fact some cases where it is impossible to meet this requirement. For example, when there is an allegation of oral sex, it is near impossible for physical evidence of the abuse to be provided, but this is a requirement of the law. Other legislative challenges: magistrates and judges are the only professionals sanctioned by the law to remove children from their homes. Nothing is wrong with that. It becomes a problem, however, when the family court, which is the agency designated to give that kind of direction, is overwhelmed, and there are an overwhelming number of cases pending. Children are again often left in abusive homes until their matter can be addressed. Gaps in policy and practice. I had to think of a nice title for this slide. What I really wanted to say was breaking the law. Most agencies, especially government agencies, follow the law. But we found that service providers are willing to violate the law in the interest of the child's safety. So there were instances, and this tended to occur more with the faith-based the non-governmental organizations and the faith-based organizations. Child victims were frequently placed in safe homes rather than referred to the police. And you found that in some safe homes where children existed, they had reached the age where they had to leave. And these service providers sometimes kept them beyond the stipulated age, or in fact organized for benefactors to rent homes and had these children stay in continued safety rather than send them out to the world knowing that they were unprepared to handle their situations. Resistance to reporting, and I think these are the last few slides. I'm not even looking at the time to see if my 15 minutes have gone for this part. But lack of safe spaces to report. It was interesting when it was revealed to us that marriage was used as one response to child sexual abuse due to the young age of marriage in the Trinidad and Tobago Marriage Acts. That's manipulation of the legislation. There were reports from social workers of police who encouraged victims of child sexual abuse and the parents to simply marry off the perpetrator and the victim. And that was shared by a female participant at the Trinidad Service Provider Workshop held here at UWI in January of last year. Under the Islamic Act, it is a female can get married by the age of 14, 12, I think it's 12 for the, I think it's 12, and males by 16. Anybody can verify for me? I think it's 12 and 16. And for Hindu, the girl has to be 14 and the male's 18. All right? So when you have a 12-year-old having sexual intercourse with a 30-year-old man, and the law says that that is child sexual abuse, you simply call on the Marriage Act and marry them off, and the problem disappears. Who cares about the psychological impact? We also found that one of the deterrents to reporting child sexual abuse was the lack of confidentiality in police stations, in the health and social services, in the school system, and even in churches. And as mentioned before, fear of assault by a perpetrator was in fact a significant deterrent. So basically, if we were to summarize what we got from this aspect of the service provider study, what we see very blatantly is an absence of rights for the child. I will close this section with 2 quotes. A participant at the service provider workshop in Trinidad shared, "Children are not seen as having rights, so when they disclose, these rights are not upheld." And someone in Tobago in a similar workshop shared, "For many services, adult permission and presence is required. In some instances, the adult required to accompany the child is the perpetrator." So these are the findings that we presented to the various service providers who we interviewed and to some of their colleagues, a larger cohort, and we asked them, what would be your recommendations? We want you to come up with draft policy recommendations. What do you suggest be done? Okay, and I have 10 minutes to just run through with you the recommendations that came out of these 2 meetings, one in Trinidad and one in Tobago. Firstly, they looked at the legal and policy framework. Definitions on the age of sexual consent should be consistent across different pieces of legislation and policies, and the definition of a child should be made standard. The rights of the child must be central to law and policy. For example, allow the child to have an adult of choice accompany them to report child sexual abuse, or have the child access services alone. Principals, teachers, guidance counselors, social workers, and other service providers should be granted the legal authority to accompany minors to report cases of child sexual abuse. Remember, we're going to have a discussion. You are going to be commenting on these recommendations. You are going to be making recommendations of your own. Also, looking at the legal and policy framework, it was recommended that protection be provided for service providers, that the marriage acts be reconciled, and that the age of marriage be raised, and that a register be established for the registering and monitoring of sex offenders. For those of you who were here last night, you might have heard and realized that that has its disadvantages as well, but a sex offenders registry with a specific goal certainly can't be wrong in our setting. A question was asked last night and reference was made to the newspaper article about the teacher who had a history of molestation, and the students found out by Googling him. Okay? We have to have in place structures to protect our children. Service delivery. This was the category where we got most of the recommendations. As it related to reporting, it was recommended that a single data collection instrument for reporting and interviewing should be developed through consultation with key stakeholder agencies, and interviews with the child should be videotaped, and the relevant stakeholders allowed to access the tape for investigation and prosecution as necessary to prevent continuous re-victimization. Services should also be expanded to include, for victims, long-term counseling support, which is available not only at the time of reporting, but sustained beyond, and steps should be taken to ensure that victims do not become prey to stigma or even retribution by providing services that single them out. Safe homes should be created in the light of mandatory reporting and removal of child victims from their homes. And for the perpetrators, there's a recommendation that long-term counseling and rehabilitation be a necessary part of the intervention. Service providers should be made to sign confidentiality agreements, and there should be penalties for breaches of confidentiality among service providers. And similarly, protocols and procedures should be established to ensure uniform, high-quality, child-friendly, seamless service for child sexual abuse victims. Facilities should be child-friendly. Children should be given child-appropriate ways to express themselves. Safe accommodation is needed for children at risk, whether it's a home specifically for children, or by increasing the age limit for providing shelter for children who accompany their battered mothers. As it relates to public education on child sexual abuse resources and services, and also education about the rights of the child. Promotion of sexuality education in schools, and innovative education using dance, drama, art, arts in action, for example, and training in how to create safe spaces for young persons to talk. I think I'm almost coming to an end now. As it relates again to public education, gender awareness and sensitization workshops should be conducted in communities, and also teachers should be exposed to these, and parenting support should be given to children, to mothers, to parents, sorry. Okay. Gender studies education should be incorporated into formal and informal education, and it should be made aware the need for gender analysis and its relevance to understanding sexuality, power relations, masculinity and femininity, child sexual abuse, and incest. The last point here I would mention, it was noted that self-care is critically needed for providers who can get easily burnt out by the workload and emotional distress of the job. Service providers should also be screened, and institutions should be strengthened. And finally, recommendations as it relates to the link with HIV. That link between forced or coerced sex and HIV is not always evident in HIV policy and practice. Child sexual abuse and incest must be recognized as a risk factor for HIV infection. Protocols are needed for the mandatory HIV testing of victims of child sexual abuse and incest. Thank you.
We now have a panel discussion, and may I introduce the other two members of the panel. They are Ms. Taria Moore and Ms. Karima Mackenzie Thomas. They are both field research officers who have been actively involved in this project, and they will share with us some of their experiences.
Good morning, everyone. I must say it was particularly interesting being part of this project when it came to interviewing stakeholders. Some of it was interesting from the aspect where I was able to observe a lot of the interaction between service providers and their clients, as opposed to sitting and having an interview. I could remember when I interviewed, I think it was Mickey from the YMCA. I had to wait a while because YMCA had some programs running, and it was particularly interesting seeing the interaction with the children and the various activities being held on the compound, and how much those activities opened up the forum where children could really express and share some of their concerns and can share their experiences, even as it relates to child sexual abuse and otherwise. However, I remember being at a children's home, and the stark reality was that they were not equipped to deal with the amount of cases that came their way, particularly because children were brought to the home through the court system. And how much training, especially the gender-sensitive training in dealing with the children, was a great aspect that would have helped in dealing with child sexual abuse and varying issues that would come up while they dealt with children on a whole. Otherwise, it was particularly nice in that so many times we have our own perceptions of the reality of child sexual abuse, and I remember knowing that yes, it existed, but the extent was something that opened my eyes, and I continue to think that society knows that it is there, but the extent to which we experience and we come across these victims is quite, there's a dichotomy, so that people usually see children react in a certain way, without that link being made to child sexual abuse. But it was particularly interesting when it came to the gender awareness and the training of those service providers who were on the front line of dealing with the children, and the distinction between those agencies that had policies and what was actually seen and what is actually delivered to the clients of those organizations. So those were just some of my observations that I've made during the research.
I kind of broke it down a bit into some categories. The first thing that really hit me was because I actually had the opportunity of interviewing two persons who were on the same level in an organization, a governmental organization, because I interviewed one not so much in error, but they let me interview that person and then realized, wait, no, you need to interview this person as well, because they shared the work, so I had to go back. And it is amazing, and I don't think, because I have been on the service provider side as well, I don't think as service providers we realize just how much our background, our culture, and our beliefs influence the services that we provide. And it's a scary thing, because you always think that you're right. But from a rights perspective, which Dr. Reid talked about, your background and culture and beliefs may be an infringement on that person's rights. Yeah? And as I said, that was amazing to me in terms of how different people dealt with the issue, how they dealt with the persons presenting, how, you know, I mean, just how they approach the entire thing, you know. And so that is one that I think the policy, the depth and width of proper policies, procedures, and systems will kind of, you know, curb, I suppose, because you can't get rid of it. But that is definitely one of the reasons why policies, procedures, and systems are so important, for those same rights, right? And to, I suppose, protect the clients from the service providers and their biases and their backgrounds and their baggage. Yeah, so that was one. And then Dr. Reid actually raised it in terms of support systems for providers. You know, debriefing, simple things like debriefing, further than self-care, written into policy, so that it's across the board mandated, no matter if you're an NGO, an FBO, a governmental agency, who or whatever you are, you do, there's a debriefing system, whether it's a state-run thing or an NGO-run thing. Records, it was a stark reality for me that most organizations didn't have proper records. And that ties into the fact that there's no standardized reporting system. Because a standardized reporting system would mean that you would have to keep records. Yeah, so even in terms of, I'm thinking, helping the clients when they present, paper trail, who did what, when, gone, not there, not existent. And then I have a concern in terms of all the various steps, and that's something I think we need to be cognizant of in terms of writing policies and procedures, where you have a child presenting, and the child moves from this person to that person, and then from this agency to that agency, and then from the next agency to the next agency, and so on, until whatever the end is, whether it fizzles and dies, whether there's resolution or whatever. What happens to this child every time they have to go to another hand or to another agency? And I'm not even talking about the retelling of this story. I'm just talking about having to acclimatize to somebody else, to a new agency, to a new system, etc., etc. I think that is something that needs to be dealt with, you know, and looked at, even in organizations, when you go from the person you talk to the counselor, and then back to somebody else within an organization, so far less across the landscape of the system. Blade lines. I saw that particularly in the Ministry of Education here. Where does your responsibility stop and mine start? To the client. So a child goes to a teacher, but the teacher is concerned about the child, and the teacher will see the child forever until the child leaves the school. Where does the teacher's responsibility stop? In terms of, you know, seeing after that child, making sure that things happen, making sure that it's resolved. And it ties into my last point about moving from hand to hand to hand. Where do the guidance counseling units step in, as opposed you know, whoever the teacher reports to, and so on and so on and so on. And that's just in one agency. Yeah, and as I said, I saw the hospital as well. Where does the medical part cut off, and then you turn it over to the psychological part of the hospital, and so on and so on. And those are things, again, that we need to kind of tighten up on in terms of our service delivery to the victims. And I think those are the major things, and just general lacking of coordination, as I said. And all these points tie back to that lack of a coordination, both interagency and on a wider scale in terms of dealing with child sexual abuse. Thank you.
I want to ask two questions, just to be a little critical here, and probably be the devil's advocate. To what extent are the principals and teachers trained in identifying the indicators of child sexual abuse? And the reason I'm asking is because the importance of this, they tend to be the initial point of contact, especially teachers, with children who might be victims of CSA. Secondly, we have to also take into account the reality of teachers and principals being able to do that, given the fact that they have these burdensome curriculums to deal with. So, if you could just comment a little bit on that, I appreciate that.
Your point is very well received. We did a workshop at the School of Education, UWI, and the kind of feedback we got is very similar to what you have shared there in terms of the not just the willingness, but the concern of teachers in taking on this additional responsibility and their own feelings of inadequacy in being able to recognize this. We accept that. The policy recommendation came from the service providers themselves, and it was basically coming out of the recognition that the law says that the child must be accompanied. And if the child must be accompanied and the parent is the perpetrator, having the option of a teacher accompanying simply gives the child that freedom to be able to seek help without having to go with the parent. Having said that, however, our project recognized, one, the value of teachers in terms of being the first point of contact with possible victims of child sexual abuse, and two, the fact that teachers themselves need to be trained. We have right now data from teachers specifically. I have it actually in this folder. It was only because of time that we weren't able to do the analysis to have this as part of the presentation. But teachers are very, very important in terms of early recognition of child sexual abuse. And I'm hoping that the data, when we analyze it, will emphasize that, the importance of teachers. And if teachers are important, then they are going to have to be trained to do it. When we hear the presentation on the model this afternoon, we will see that, in fact, we have begun the process of sensitizing, training teachers in recognizing child sexual abuse, being able to have appropriate, age-appropriate conversations on sexuality, sexual behaviors, and child sexual abuse, incest, and AIDS. And it is going to require an incorporation of all of that into the curriculum for training for teachers. And I think, as Professor Reddock was saying this morning, that's why we went to the School of Education and not necessarily to the schools. It is going to be a process, and a process that will culminate, hopefully, in teachers feeling competent to do it and having it as part of their workload, so it will no longer be burdensome, if you understand what I mean.
Thank you for your presentation. When you are presenting about the procedural challenges, you have mentioned about the agencies don't accept all reported incidents by minor as a truth. So my question here is, how can, suppose if the agencies are not looking at the child, when the child is emotionally disturbed, physically it has a problem, then what will be the solution? And is there any investigation procedure adopted by the agencies to find out whether the child is telling the truth or not?
Okay, I hope I got your question. You're asking, well, I got the last part, whether the agency does any kind of investigating to see if the child is telling the truth. Yeah, and what was the first part of your question?
Because the first part of my question is about the child already, it will be emotional disturbance will be there when the agency is not accepting the child's problem. then again the child will be more disturbed.
Okay, yes. So you're looking at, it's in fact a process of re-victimization.
Yeah,
the child
so
presents as a victim, and now you're saying, as in the presentation this morning and as we saw in the film, I don't believe you. You are always lying. That is what was coming across.
Yeah.
So you're asking, how does one get around that?
Yes.
I think we need to ask ourselves the question, why would the service provider not believe the child? And the answer to that can't be a simple one. I'm sure that there are many components to that. It has to do with our culture, the way we perceive children, the way we perceive child sexual abuse, which still remains a very taboo phenomenon. It probably has to do with the personal experiences of the person, him or herself. So there are many, many reasons why someone would want to disbelieve a child. Maybe it's just their own discomfort in dealing with the issue. I think that what we are doing in this project is the start of a solution for that.
Okay.
It would require sensitization, it would require education, it would require people facing up to what they feel as individuals about child sexual abuse and doing something about it.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe we can have one of the field investigators say a little about what the agencies do in terms of possible investigation.
Well, no, as far as we came across, there is some legislation existing in terms of, I know the police do it, or they're supposed to, in terms of following up and, you know, doing that same investigation. That is the job of the police. And so an agency would send turn the child over to the police, any agency, because reporting is mandatory. And it's for that very reason. Yes, as I said, supposed. And what Dr. Reid said, remember, it's of child sexual abuse and incest are extremely prevalent. There are providers who will argue that it is that the issues are entrenched in our culture. Yeah, I came across a lot of resignation because of that, like, you know, throw your hands up in the air because it happens and it's a cultural thing. And then there are also people who told me, whether on or off record, that they themselves had been victims, never dealt with it. And so you have to look at the re-stimulation and all those kinds of things. And so I think that as part of policies that are being put in place for support for providers, one of the things that needs to be looked at is pre-counseling and in the training process for persons who are going to be on the front line dealing with children presenting as having been abused. There needs to be some component of counseling, because there are many more than less people in the fields, because a lot of people who have been victims themselves gravitate towards trying to help others, yeah? Except that they've never dealt with their stuff. And so, hey.
Okay, thank you.
If I may add, in our experience, many times children who have been sexually abused and made reports to us, when the family members are interviewed, quite often their mothers do not support the claim of the child. I have heard many times mothers who said, don't bother with that child, she's a liar. And that is a cultural thing as well as a financial issue sometimes. And we need to recognize that.
Thank you.
I think also agencies have to be able to know that necessarily their role may not be and should not really be an investigative role. That's the role of the police. But what can I do with someone who is presenting to me that they have been abused? Am I here to investigate if it's really true, and only then am I going to provide some sort of support, or am I going to take the benefit of the doubt of that child and give the support nonetheless? So I think agencies have to be able to draw that distinction, that my role is to bring support, and I think it all ties down to agencies not having protocols and procedures and a perimeter in which they function, but they just do it as something happens and as the need arises.
I just wanted to respond to a couple of things. The truth is I have several concerns. but I'll talk to Sandra on that outside of here. Reference being made to the teacher recruitment, and the incident took place very recently. I think we need to be very careful as we make reference to that, because it is not a Ministry of Education policy. This was a case where the school would have employed someone privately on their own, and the person was not recruited through government recruitment, etc., etc. And this is somebody who was employed on a short-term basis by the school, paid for by their own funds, etc. And this is a returning resident who only came in the country very recently, and the offenses were committed. So let me not say too much on that, but I do not want us to get the impression that the Ministry of Education will recruit a teacher who has had. As a matter of fact, the process is that you will apply, your name will be on a teacher's register, and once you have committed a criminal offense, you are struck off the register, and you will be dismissed, etc., etc. So this is a highly abnormal situation. The person was on the job just for one day. So I think we ought to be very, very careful how we reference that case. Secondly, reference was made to the family court, and I believe it was said it's only the family court could move a child, etc., etc. That too is inaccurate. The family court has limited jurisdiction at this point in time. So if you are living in any other part of the country, in any magistrate's court, the magistrate would have the child removed. And there are several reasons for that, but children can be removed, and there's a time frame for the matter to go before the courts, because none of us would want anybody just walking in our house and picking up our children and that sort of thing. Parents have rights too. And one has to be careful that there must be a delicate balance. But if there is evidence that a child is at risk, the child can be removed immediately by police, sometimes accompanied by social workers, etc., can be removed, put in a home, a place of safety, and there is a time frame for the police to be taking the matter before the courts. So we in education have moved children, during the working hours, etc. So reference again made to the Marriage Act. I think we ought to be careful, because we should not suggest, and it seems to suggest, that only the Hindu and Muslim Marriage Act allows for children to marry at an early age. The fact is, Trinidad and Tobago has 4 marriage acts. Well, there are 4. There is the Christian marriage, so-called the Civil Marriage Act, which sometimes refers to as the Christian Marriage Act. In Trinidad we have these nicknames. And that act also allows for a minor to be married. So I think we ought not to be cocky-eyed and pinpoint the the Muslim and the Hindu Marriage Act as the only culprits. The so-called the Civil Marriage Act also allows for early marriages. The only marriage act that specifies the age that is acceptable in terms of the 18 years and so on is the Orisha Marriage Act. So there are actually 4 marriage acts in Trinidad and Tobago. And somebody raised the question of education and where does the teacher give up, etc. Ministry of Education has a circular memorandum number 76, which specifies how we should treat with child sexual offenses. Very, very clear protocols are treated in that circular, and that is because we have had to respond to several cases over the years. So there's absolutely no doubt how a teacher should proceed, how a principal should proceed, and where does the guidance and counseling, student support services fit into all of this. So the reports are made accordingly and so on. So for the Ministry of Education, there's a circular memorandum number 76, which the Ministry of Education holds all its personnel to. And that circular has, meetings have been conducted in every education district in Trinidad where that circular has been explained, etc., etc. So those are some of the comments I would like to share, but like I said, there are others over which I have some serious concerns which I would treat with. And in terms of child sexual abuse, we have to bear in mind that the Children's Act was written X number of years ago. There's a bill that is in preparation at this point in time, And if you look at that bill, you'll see there is a whole new range of sexual offenses. So as we talk sexual offenses in Trinidad, we have to go beyond, because this new bill, there's a significant difference between what the provisions in this bill than what currently exists in the Children's Act. There's a completely new range of sexual offenses inside of there. And then when you look at the Children's Authority Act, the Children's Authority Act specifies how children are to be treated when they are victims of any form of abuse. So I just, want to share that we need to expand how we look at some of these issues at this point in time. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Mr. Ragunanan for his sharing. He has certainly highlighted a lot of what has been presented from the workshop participants. We report what the workshop participants say, and in fact a lot of the comments he has made has highlighted the difficulties that they face. For example, he talks about the protocol that is available for the Ministry of Education and their employees. What we learned from our teachers is that they were not even aware of this. It exists, the teachers are not aware. So it may be there, but the issues are not just only about not having the policies, but it's also about people being aware of them and enforcing them. Even as it relates to the magistrate court and so, the time frame may be in place, but when that child is removed from the home, where does that child go? There are no safe homes that are available. So the reality is, if we look at the bigger picture, we still have a lot of work to do. We still have to look at the policies, we still have to look at the procedures, and I was really glad he brought up the issue of the teacher, because I think he kind of cemented that a registry for offenders may not be a bad idea after all, because if a teacher is found to be an offender and is struck off the list, then what you're doing is making an offenders list right then and there, right? So we have the beginning of a list, and there may be some value in this after all. So thank you, and we shall chat outside.
One of the things that you spoke about, you drew an example of a service provider that worked in a community and identifying sexual abuse in that community and not reporting. I myself, having worked as a service provider, could somehow relate to that situation, because one has to bear in mind that there are communities of abuse, and the communities of abuse could be, divided into two strata. The one that you described, where there might be intergenerational abuse, and where there's learned helplessness, but there's also, I have encountered situations as well, or a situation where the community itself benefited from the abuse of children and were reluctant. Not only were they reluctant, but resistive to anyone trying to do anything about it. So I think that has to be taken into consideration. I also heard you talk about the lack of and consistency of training by police officers, and you made reference to the medicals. And I also want to extend that the way in which forensic investigations are done with respect to sexual abuse at our accident and emergency could also be frustrating for police officers, because having worked for a while at Child Guidance, I have heard Dr. Sharp lamented several times about evidence that came where the report may just read that hymen intact without any description of the positioning of hymen. And I don't know, maybe you could correct me, I don't know whether we in fact have a pediatric gynecologist that could really effectively examine children. So these are some of the issues even at that level that has to be addressed. And I don't want to really labor the situation, but I just, for probably research, look at, we made mention of the various acts and the age of consent for marriage, but I want to just do comparison with areas where minors getting married by consent is the mainstream culture, and even in areas where it is the subculture, whether in fact it is traumatic for those children. And I'm saying that not to support sexual abuse by any means, no, but just to look at comparison in the light of comments that has been made that it is the law that makes child sexual abuse traumatic. I am not an advocate of child sexual abuse, be clear. I am just looking at it for research purposes and comparison. And also the whole issue of single data collection instrument, I also want to make reference to that because there are social workers who might be interviewing a child and doing a clinical interview and therefore looking for specific clinical presentation. And that is as opposed to a forensic interview where you may be looking at timelines and stuff like that. So if there's a single data collection instrument, then you're asking social workers to wear two hats. Be the hat of a clinical social worker looking for clinic and also for looking for the forensic timeline stuff, you know, and I'm just concerned as to how it is going to work, you know, so these are my...
Just to address that last point, you're right, it's not practical. I think, though, that it is necessary that there's standardization, and if it means coming up with standardized reporting for each silo, so as you pointed out, forensic, clinical, from the social side, etc., then fine. And then there's some kind of collation of that data into, you know, some bigger thing. But standardization has to, or well, best case scenario should be done. If somebody's doing forensic, I mean, everybody would know what they need to do. And so that's my thing. Whoever is creating these tools must go again cross-industry, well, industry, sorry, wrong forum, cross-sector. and you know, identify what types of information need to be captured. And
the child would come to a service provider. And generally, the professional of the service provider may be a social worker and maybe a psychologist and so on. I don't know that we have much forensic social workers here, one. So I don't know how it is going to work unless there's training in both.
Well, remember training in release.
Training is a vital part of...
In launching something like that, there must be training, there must be updated training, refresher training, tweaking of the thing. So that is a given. But yeah, it can be done. It can be done. Yeah. You know what, you raised an interesting point though, and I don't know if it's something anybody ever looked at, and this is a systemic thing throughout Trinidad and Tobago. We still have children coming out of school and saying, I want to be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, a business person, and so on. When is it that we're going to start mapping? Because you see, in every sector, we could bemoan the fact that we don't have anybody doing this, and we don't have anybody doing that, and we have a shortage of this and a dearth in that. But unless we start doing an audit, and, you know, actually putting out there, these are the categories of human resource that we need. These are the things that people need to be trained in, and so on. It'll never be done. And so, you know, this is a total aside, but I'm just throwing it out there because somebody, you know, either giving funding or somebody looking for a research project might be willing to do that, to start an audit of, you know, in a best case scenario, in some kind of perfect model, what are the niches that we don't have now, that we need to insert people into, so that we can start telling that to children when they're picking subjects at Form 3. We can tell them that at Form 1, so they know what, you know, what stream they're charting, etc., etc. Yeah?
And I want to just mention one thing. You know, oftentimes we have the opportunity to work with victims of child sexual abuse. I have had 3 occasions to work with perpetrators themselves, and it's not in all cases perpetrators this predator going after. Sometimes perpetrators themselves could be victims. And I think in terms of how you manage the whole gamut of child sexual abuse, sometimes management and counseling of perpetrators sometimes forgotten. Yeah.
Okay, I don't want you to go away with the feeling that when we talk about standardization for intake, we're talking about forensic audits and that kind of thing. That's not the intention. The intention is that if a child presents for care, it is that child's right to be properly evaluated. And if evaluation means simply asking a question in a non-threatening and empathetic manner, has anyone ever touched you inappropriately? I don't think we need a special skill for that. You see, what we're really looking at is evaluating our children with the knowledge that child sexual abuse is prevalent, with the knowledge that they may be victims, with the knowledge that they are simply waiting for somebody to ask, are you a victim? It's really about that, and it's about having a procedure in place so that when that child presents, that child has everybody on his or her side. And similarly, when the perpetrator presents, that he or she too has everybody on his or her side. So it's not about everybody becoming expert or specialist, and it's not about condemnation and who's good or who's bad. It's simply about being able to help and doing this in a manner that is consistent with rights for the child and is consistent with best international practice.
I want to go back to the question which was raised yesterday, and today I hear it again, which is women always know, or mothers always know, and keep it silent. I think it's important to understand that we live in a culture of violence. And within that culture of violence, we must understand the psychological damage that the battered woman syndrome plays in even the woman being able to speak about what she knows about, as so if you're saying that she does always know. And if she does know, what assessment tools do you have to intervene, to understand that she herself is a victim in ways that gives you more agency to empower her to speak, as opposed to dismiss her? Because often what I'm hearing from since yesterday and today is this notion that black women, or women in the Caribbean, are barbaric and encourage incest and encourage sexual violence. But I'm not hearing that you're giving them the tools to make healthy choices, to understand the conditions so that they're able to then be empowered to speak to the issue. One, a culture of violence is always a culture of silence. So when we are talking about incest and sexual abuse, we are talking about a culture of silence. And the question is, how do you learn to unlearn, to relearn that culture in ways that you bring forward a tenderness in doing this work? And I think we should all love our jobs. No, I mean, if you don't like your job, I think you should leave it. Simply put, we should do our jobs with passion and have purpose for our jobs. We shouldn't be doing a job because it pays bills. We should be doing a job because we love it and we have a purpose. So the question of rights, you don't have a right to a job if you don't have a right to do a good job. So the question of doing a good job is very important in assessing the kind of things we're talking about here. So to get to tenderness, we have to talk about happiness in our own selves when we do our work. So if we are not happy with our jobs, we can't be happy with the people we're going to work with, right? The question of evaluation tools, and Dr. Reid, you'll probably know this better than me, what type of evaluation tools are out there for social workers to use so that when they interview, they can interview with a certain amount of tenderness and use anger as corrective surgery and not anger as vindictive surgery. So in ways that we can get at an understanding of where women are coming from, who we say no, that don't report. Thank you.
I'm going to keep my response very, very brief. For all that you said first, how do we do it? We start the Breaking the Silence project. That's how we do it. That's how we get started. There are so many, this project, I mean, we're sitting here and we're hearing about it and a lot has been done and we are very pleased with what has been done. But we also acknowledge that it is nothing more than the merest tip of the iceberg. We haven't reached anywhere yet. We haven't started anything yet. We want money to do more stuff, right? All we have done is to say to Trinidad and Tobago, hey people, child sexual abuse is real. That's all we've done so far, right? We've also reached a certain point, and tomorrow there will be a session on the findings of the study so far. And as I said, we haven't analyzed them fully. So we are beginning to understand what sustains child sexual abuse in our society. Who are the abusers? Why do they abuse? Why do societies or communities tolerate and accept an abuser? We heard some already, the socioeconomics in it. I mean, there's so many questions that have to be answered before we can even think about making a dent in this problem. And we can do that just slowly and surely, and we are committed to doing that, right? So we appreciate that there's a lot to be done. And I appreciate your comment, Wesley, about the tenderness. You asked about a tool for tenderness. I'm not aware of any. That has to come from the heart. Sorry.
Go ahead. Hello, good day. My question is in relation to child sexual abuse and HIV. I wonder whether the project has been able to delve into the procedure that is followed if a child who has been abused contracts HIV, and how is it dealt with? Is it different to a person who does not contract HIV due to child sexual abuse? Thank you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, people are not generally aware of the link between child sexual abuse and HIV. And what we found in this service provider study is that very few children are actually tested for HIV. So we haven't even reached to the point yet where there are differential services for those who are positive as opposed to those who are HIV negative. And that is one of the goals, one of the objectives of this project, to raise that awareness of the linkage between child sexual abuse and incest and HIV infection. And if at the end of it we can be sure that a protocol is put in place where all children who are victims are tested, then we would have begun a process of looking at what is done if the child is found to be positive. You may remember one of the slides I presented is just over 30% of agencies say that they provide services to HIV positive victims of child sexual abuse. So that is one area that we have to work on as caregivers in our society.
On that same point, though, one of the roadblocks is that when minors are, when it's suggested that minors should be taken to be tested for HIV, quite often they request the presence of the parents. And sometimes the parents may be the perpetrators, so that is not always possible. But I do agree with Dr. Reid, that should be a standardized practice that all victims of child sexual abuse should automatically be examined for HIV.
Very quickly, I just wanted to ask, as it relates to recommendations, it struck me when you were making the presentations, and I wanted to know if the project went there in terms of looking at recommendations. Something that I read about violence against women in Trinidad, and I think the example could be extrapolated to the wider Caribbean. And what they found was that victims tended to use informal, quote-unquote, informal kinds of support as opposed to going to agencies, because there's this suspicion of the agency, being that we live in small communities, that the information that you give is never treated confidentially. This is not to say that our industry or agency officials do not understand the confidentiality protocols and so on, but it has more to do with the fact that somebody might see you going to the welfare department in a particular country and make assumptions about why you're going there, right? And because I think that we are as professional in the Caribbean as anywhere else in the world. My question is, given that informal types of support are so important in this, did the study go as far as trying to find some of these recommendations coming out of communities? How can communities be empowered? How can neighbors and aunts and uncles and other family members be empowered in the process of quote-unquote providing service? And I was wondering if the recommendations went that far, or if the project sought to see the ways in which we could empower communities in combating child sexual abuse.
In fact, this afternoon after lunch, you're going to be hearing a little bit about the community model, and you will see where, in fact, communities themselves identified what they wanted and who they wanted empowered. So yes, we did go into the communities, we did educate, we did empower, and we do have preliminary data to show the evaluation data, which shows that early indices suggests that we have had a positive impact in the communities.
I was particularly interested in one of the recommendations that was put up earlier on by yourself, Dr. Reid, is it? Am I getting it right? Okay. The recommendation with regards to a child being removed and being placed in a place of safety. And I think straight after that it said something about the perpetrator receiving counselling and support. Very good idea. I have some concerns based on previous consultation I've been attending for the last couple of days, and one of the recommendations that we were putting forward was that why should the child always be the one that's removed? Did that come up at all in this work that you were doing, and is there a possibility of there being a recommendation of the perpetrator being removed so the child is not further victimized as a one, why me?
Excellent point. What was reported on in the presentation are the policy recommendations that the service providers themselves came up with. They are not recommendations from us, the project managers. They are the recommendations that the service providers made based on the data we fed back to them. I was only at one of them, not two, and I don't remember that having been a part of the discussion at all. That did not come up. I think the focus instead was on the safety of the child and the fact that given our culture, many times the man was the breadwinner of the family. That is not to suggest by any means that incest or child sexual abuse only occurs when the man is the breadwinner. I'm not suggesting that by any means, but I'm saying that many times, as in the little scenario we saw last night, it was the man's house, and the man had taken the woman and her daughter into the house. So when he was accused of child sexual abuse, he put them out of his house. So I think it was more in terms of that kind of context. The safety of the child was being regarded. You take the child out of the dangerous environment and put them in a safe home. But what you are suggesting is very relevant. And when we sit now with another group of stakeholders and we sit with persons who have more expertise in terms of managing these things, then we will certainly consider that in terms of coming up with our final recommendations.
I'm particularly concerned that we are talking about, okay, I have worked as a medical social worker for 20 plus years, okay, and then worked at the National AIDS Program dealing with HIV and individuals, children included. But my concern is that I know that a few years ago the Rape Crisis Society had a program called Breaking the Silence, and today we are discussing about Break the Silence. Child sexual abuse is something that will always be kept in the closet, so it will always be silent. And we talk a lot about the providers being prepared to actually work with survivors of any sort of sexual abuse. But yet still, we have not spoken about how an individual can actually identify that, that they are being sexually abused. I'm saying that because in a lot of instances, it's only if there was some medical referral or a teenager who may have been thought to be pregnant, would it come to our notice as social workers that they were actually being sexually abused at home. A lot of children grew up believing that being interfered with or molested by a relative is a natural way of life, unless they discuss it with a friend who says, hey, something wrong is happening in your home, you need to talk to someone else. My whole point is that we have to start educating the children from a very young age about being aware of their bodies and being aware about good touch, bad touch, what makes you feel good and what makes you feel uncomfortable. But I'm not hearing anything about us talking about preparing them while we are talking about giving service, one. Secondly, as adults, we are very good at seeking the interest of those who cannot speak for themselves, or so we do believe, forgetting that they too have a voice, and we have the UN Rights of a Child that gives children a voice, and yet still we do not include them in the decision-making process that involves them. A lot of mothers are in denial, but someone alluded to the fact that the mothers also need to be treated. And a lot of mothers will disclose their knowledge of the sexual activity taking place at home when they too are exposed to treatment. Okay? Of course, through fear and everything else, they will actually deny the whole thing about whether their husband is. Because I've known where mothers have actually given up their beds and slept on the couch so that the husband can have his way with the child, so that he can remain at home instead of going out in the community. And when we talk about HIV testing for children, remember, for many, the sexual abuse would have been taking place over a period of years. And it's only when it comes to our knowledge, we run out frantically doing all sorts of tests and assuming a lot of things. But again, if it is suspected that the child has been exposed to any sort of HIV, we have what you call the non-prophylaxis treatment that a child will be put on to. Okay, so a child will be pre-tested, and if we suspect that the child has been exposed, the child will be treated and for a period of time and tested again. Thank you.
Mentioned 3 tools as we were discussing tools particularly. And one is for men, particularly connecting with tenderness. There is a group that has started and has been going for about 6 months now, and it's called a men's forum. It started as School for Tobago, and it helps men to speak to each other. It's run by men, and it's actually extremely effective. And it helps them connect with their emotions, to discuss ways of being men, into masculinity, into gender relations and sexual relations. And it is a very, I think, good model to look at. The other tool that I'm aware of, which is very effective in dealing with incest and child sexual abuse, is to nurture a good relationship between fathers and their children. And the program that does this works with fathers even before their children are born, and helps them and the mother to talk to, relate to, and stroke the child before the child is born. And then the father, of course, is there for the birth of the child and continues that relationship. Now, what that does is, in strengthening a healthy and nurturing relationship between a father and his child, it gives a boundary to children so that they are less likely to accept negative and destructive behavior, particularly in physical behavior. And that program has been run in various parts of Trinidad and worked very effectively. And what people have said is, I never knew things could be done differently. And the third program I would like to point out too is we heard mention last night of restorative justice programs. Well, one restorative justice program is called Circles. Circles can be used for many different types of purposes, but circles of support allow children and adults to actually narrate stories in a way that helps them to connect and strengthen themselves, in a way that can lead to discussions of justice, but can also lead just to creating stronger relationships, stronger sense of self-identity, worth and dignity, and so forth. And the last point I would like to make is the whole media campaign around the Blue Teddy, which has been very successful. I think it would be very helpful now if we could go to the next stage, where it would be tell the children who are hurt to ring the Blue Teddy and talk to him. And the Blue Teddy would then be the signal for people in ChildLine and the other places that pick up the telephone to know that they are responding specifically to this awareness and sensitization program, to take it one step further beyond just promoting the Teddy. Thank you.
One comment and a question, and probably putting it on the floor as well. And I thought the intervention from the lady and the gentleman here in the blue shirt was very good as well. But I think there's 2 things I think we do have a challenge in. One is in terms of the society acceptance and how we break that one. I think that's a huge challenge. And I think one of the things is also acknowledge that we do have a problem, and not just shuffle it under the carpet and then just change the carpet and then continue to shuffle the problem in. And also a little bit on stopping it on the culture, because everyone has its own culture. It's just the acceptance of the violence. And if you rape someone in Europe, it's the same horrendous crime as you rape somebody somewhere else in the world. A crime is a crime, and I think we have to looking at it as well like that. But I think one of the other challenges we do have is the whole thing around protocol, because if in many countries do have pretty good protocols in place, but people don't know about the protocols. And then some of the protocols are also old, so we probably have to also then go back again and looking at the existing protocols and to see how we can update the protocols to make it more relevant depending where we are today. Because also if you're looking at the Commonwealth system and the law system, it's quite a comprehensive systems and legislation which is put in place. It's just very outdated. And I think that is some of the area which we think we not only need the academia or the political establishment, but we also need to have the voices of the people saying enough is enough, and we need to come into the 21st century. And I think that is one of the key areas which we need to discuss, we really need to bring forward, and not only using the media campaign for the 2 days which we are going on here now, and then we go home and we forget about it, and then we meet somewhere else in one of the Caribbean islands and start talking about it. But how do we, and that's where I think we all need each other help. How do we make sure that this is a continuing process in order to create the changes which is required to do? And also, if we really want to break the silence, because we always say, you know, and I can discuss it from my own organization, UNICEF, and I can say, who is UNICEF? Who is UNICEF? It's people. We decide the future of UNICEF because we are the staff and the members of UNICEF. And we tell ourselves what is accepted within the UNICEF, within the rules and regulations. And if we don't have the ethic and the norms, as an example, we do have, but if we don't have it and we accept to let it slip away, in the end we cannot stand for what we're supposed to stand for. And the same thing goes with the Trinidadian society, the Caribbean society, and each and every one of us. We have to decide what we stand for as a society. No one else, not the politicians, not the institutions, but we as individual people. And I think that's the hardest way to break and to accept. Thank you.
And again, we are simply giving to you what we were told. Yeah, we're a medium, a vessel. We are not sitting here telling you what we think. Please bear that in mind. And so Ms. Knuckles spoke about, you know, children being able to identify when they're being abused, and that's true. There were providers that raised that. But my thing is, and this is me, Karima, speaking now, yeah, we as a society need to start, if we really want to fix the problem, because I mean, we could just, you know, continue using Band-Aids, asking some very hard questions and being honest. You cannot, on the one hand, try to tell a child about good touch and bad touch and what makes me feel good and bad and that they need to speak up. And on the next hand, teach them from as young as they can remember that it is okay for anybody in my household to hit me when they feel like it, to scream at me when they feel like it, to treat me however they feel like when they feel like it, and that children should be seen and not heard. Children pick up inconsistency very, very quickly. And I'm not saying that to say it's not an argument for or against corporal punishment or anything of the sort. Don't even, please. Yeah, I'm just saying that in order to try and fix a problem, we have to start from a basis of truth and honesty and realness. And until we decide to deal with that in ourselves and as a society, we cannot expect it from children, because that's what children do. Children will say the thing that you're thinking, and you didn't say it to that person. Yeah, we know this. And it's incongruous to expect them on the one hand to stand there and take whatever we dole out on a daily basis, and on the other hand, to then think, well, this particular type of touch don't make me feel good either, but you know, I'm supposed to tell somebody about this one. I don't like that one either, but I could deal with that one. Children can't do that. And we need to decide what we want from them and for them.
I'm aware that currently children in certain groups and settings are being made fully aware of good touch, bad touch, and more than just good touch, bad touch in a sexual sense. They are also being made aware that a bad touch would include being hit, being pushed down, and it is some level of awareness, at least especially with me, in the things that I do, that we are particularly putting out there for children, that there is a good touch and a bad touch, and the bad touch doesn't just include a sexual touch, but it is, and it can be a lot more than that. So children are being made aware through various organizations of what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate, whether it makes you feel good or not, because there is a big debate that it could feel good, you know, from a biological standpoint, but then it needs to be out there, whether it feels good or not. It's inappropriate for it to happen, and that is one of the areas that needs to be distinguished when we put in that body of knowledge out there to children. It is appropriate, and it is not appropriate when we deal with it.
UNICEF Regional Office. I mean, I'm extremely happy that finally there was this link between all forms of violence, sexual abuse, incest, corporal punishment. I think when, I mean, we just came from a meeting on the follow-up of the UN study on violence against children. And Professor Pinheiro was with us yesterday. And one of the main priority for Professor Pinheiro and for also the special representative on, of the Secretary General on violence against children is the prohibition, total prohibition of all form of violence, starting from corporal punishment. Because that's the one, as you said, a very one ideas that we put in children's mind, that in sometimes violence is with love. I mean, we have to hit you because we love you, we want to discipline you, and then other times there's bad touch. I mean, so I'm extremely glad that this is, this links has been made, and that also will, I hope, be taken into account in the follow-up of that action research study that we're doing, and for that we can count on UNICEF support.
And, you know, because a lot of Trinbagonians would say, oh, but they got rid of corporal punishment and look, children beating teachers. You know why? We were lazy about it. We got rid of it, and we put nothing in place. And you see, that's it. But it's okay because we're comfortable. And I think as a community, as a national community, we need to stop being comfortable. I mean, and as I said, this is totally as an aside, but how far are we going to let it go? Yeah? And so that's the other thing. It's not getting rid of something and leaving a vacuum. It's being very constructive and having forums such as these to put the right things in place to make whatever we're getting rid of, you know, be replaced by something that works and is progressive.
I think the biggest challenges we do have throughout, not only the Caribbean, but throughout the world, how do you take away one tool which has been considered by everybody to be an effective tool? Because it's not only about right and wrong, but it's people's perception. And if I say to myself, I'm the best ever, and all of you think you're the worst ever, I'm the worst ever. Because that's people's perception. And people's perceptions is extremely powerful. So if people's perceptions is, which we have done a polling in Barbados actually on the corporal punishment, people's perception is that it works. And try to take it away in the homes, it works even worse. So you're going to have a, you know. So what do we then replace it with? Because my colleague is absolutely right. It doesn't belong in the 21st century. It never belonged there. China took it away, you know, in 1877. 1877, China took away corporal punishment. Sweden's going to have its 30th anniversary in a couple of weeks or months' time. 30 years since they abolished corporal punishment in the homes. They are worse off than anybody other countries. But the challenge is, what do we replace it with? And that's what I'm going to come to. In our office, we are working on what we call alternative discipline practices. So what we start saying, hang on, don't hit your child, don't spank your child, don't beat it, don't use the cane, don't do what happened up in Jamaica where a teacher used the belt and the buckle of the belt hit the child and the child went healthy to the school in the morning and came home and was blind. And that's the truth. But we can find alternative discipline practices because we believe, actually, UNICEF, that with rights comes responsibilities and accountabilities. And we have to teach children the right, the accountabilities, and the responsibilities. But it's different tools and different ways of doing it. So my challenge to all of you, and I promise you I'm not going to say more, let us together find the same tools as we have developed in the rest of the Caribbean. And we have several schools and principals and teachers union supporting us to find how we can teach our children the accountabilities, the responsibilities, and give the teachers the tools and the parents the tools to do the right discipline and to discipline children when it's required, but doing the right thing to do it. Because children, like we all do, and I was a child myself, needs to be sometimes taught what is right and wrong, but let us use the right tools. And we are here to help all of you to do so.
I just want to remind persons that what we are embarking on, and I think it has been said before, is not a simple task. Child sexual abuse is an extremely complex phenomenon, and we would be foolhardy if we think that we can fix it or change everything that predisposes to it in a short space of time. So I want to endorse what has been said before and just encourage everyone to, one step at a time, let us do what we can to make a difference. I think that already it is being discussed. A forum like this tells us that something has started. We are beginning to talk about it, and I think if we work together, we too can make a difference. We just need to be patient.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reid. This has been a very interactive session, and we thank you for all your comments. As Dr. Reid reminded us, what was presented, those were the findings from service providers. They did not represent the views of the BTS project itself. However, we did recognize gaps that have been brought up, and I think the main ones concern sensitization and training. And this has to do with what kind of people we are. One of the members of the audience mentioned that we live in a violent society. That is true. We have to accept that, and each one of us need to ask ourselves, what can I do to change it? It has to come from each one of us, from within. We just have to look at the way we drive. It is extremely aggressive, and look at the fatalities that we have, right? So we need to sensitize ourselves, our children. We need to teach them how to recognize child sexual abuse. I myself have come across children who told me that they were being abused sexually by their fathers or stepfathers from the age of 10 and 12, but they did not recognize that there was anything wrong. They thought that is what fathers do to daughters. They recognized it when they went to secondary school, they did biology, they start discussing it, the body and what it's for, etc. And that is when they realized that they were being sexually abused. And when they reported to the teachers, it is then taken to the police. But again, we have the issue of mothers that never support their daughters, or most of the time did not. Now, I am not blaming the mothers, because we know that that is another complicated area that we have to examine. But these are all issues that we need to look at. But I think this project has broken the ground. I think together, each one of us, as individuals, as members of a family, and as members of community and of this country, can work towards making a difference. And we call on the representatives of the government, some of whom are present, the international agencies that are present, as well as all of us who are involved in this service to our children. They are the future, and we need to support them the best that we can. Thank you very much.
Gonna make it through this darkness. A light would shine someday for me. Yes, it will. I know that you won't leave me in this thing. Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? I heard him say, hush, don't say a word. Gonna get messy if anybody heard. I heard him say, hush, don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know who I am? A well-known woman, a respected man. Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? I heard him say, hush, don't say a word. Gonna get messy if anybody heard. I heard him say, hush, don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you'll put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know who I am? A well-known woman, a respected man. I'm breaking the silence 'cause I'm under attack. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. And take my life back.